Could we kickstart? Yeah, thumbs up. Yeah, okay, let's go. Let's do this. We're all super excited. I'm very, very excited. Okay, so yes, a very, very warm welcome to each and every one of you to this CCT event funded by the National Forum, of course, the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning as part of this year's seminar series. So just to let you know, those of you who like to tweet and are on Twitter, there is a hashtag, and I'll just pop that into the chat. So please use this particular hashtag for today's event. Hope you can see that. Yes, I can is the tweet. How positive, what a positive start to the morning. So fantastic. So the event is titled Strategies for Promoting Student Self-Efficacy in Higher Education. And we hope through our excellent speakers today and through your contribution, by the way, to the event, we'll have a better understanding of the concept of self-efficacy and how it can be enhanced, developed, and applied in practice. So yeah, my name is Graham Gamble, and I'll be hosting the event today and doing some MC work. And together, of course, with my co-host Marie O'Neill, who's head of enhancement at CCT, she's hiding in there as well. And she's very much the engine room behind this event. So thanks, Marie. So before we discuss our speakers, I would like to present a short 1-minute video that was constructed by the National Forum. So I'm going to share my screen and play this. What happens sometimes when you do play videos through Zoom in terms of audio, it may get gurgled on your side. So I will paste it in the chat just in case. And if that happens, you can mute me and play it on your side. It is only literally 1 minute, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So I'll share my screen and do that now. Here we go. Hopefully you can see that. You can see that video, yeah? Excellent. Okay, here we go. Excellent. I hope that played well on your side. Nice catchy beat to that video. Yeah, of course, thanks to the National Forum, I suppose bringing us all together in public and private institutions, and all for the greater good of our staff across the sectors. So thanks to the National Forum. Okay, so yes, back to our speakers. We do, of course, have some exciting speakers today, including Dr. Laura Ritchie, our keynote, who's going to break down the concept of self-efficacy in an understandable and meaningful way. And we also have Dr. Maura Mcguire, who will provide us with examples of how we can develop and apply self-efficacy in practice, and Oisin Hassan, who will talk us through how self-efficacy can be developed through student partnership, a huge piece of work that's done by NSTEP. And I'll actually also provide a short presentation on some of my own insights into my own doctoral studies, focusing on self-efficacy too. So just some quick housekeeping announcements. So this is a 2-hour event. So of course, naturally, you may need to take a break as we go along. So please feel free to do so. We didn't build in a universal break simply because we wanted to squeeze in as much as possible, given the gravitas of our speakers. We have a lot to say, of course, on this topic, and we wanted to share it with you today. We do have some interactive activities as well, just to let you know. As I said earlier on, we are looking for your contribution, and we want to hear from you. I think it's really, really important. And so questions and comments are very welcome. So please use the chat system to post questions or comments as we go along. And what we'll do is, as we have breaks between speakers, we'll come back and revisit those questions and address them as best as possible. Okay, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce Dr. Laura Ritchie, who is Professor of Learning and Teaching at the University of Chichester. So Laura is a passionate advocate for the development of student self-efficacy and regularly publishes and speaks on the topic. Laura has written a book titled Self-Efficacy in Higher Education, and we've convinced Laura, if you're still up for this, Laura, to donate a few copies as prizes for today's event. So stay tuned for more. So a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Laura Ritchie. So over to you, Laura.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen and hope this works and make that go. There we go. So share screen, okay? Perfect. Before I start in with the regular presentation, you know, all the stuff that's planned, as Graham said, there are some interactive things. So if you've got a phone, pick it up, if it's a smartphone, you know, one that takes pictures, because on the very next slide is going to be a QR code that takes you to a Padlet. And if you don't know about Padlet, it's like a whiteboard. Basically, I'm going to ask you a question, and I would like you, for the first question, to pop down the first thing that comes to your mind. This is even before we get into the topic of self-efficacy, what it is, the research, all that stuff. And the second one's a bit more tricky. So, okay, you ready for the first question? Here comes the first question. The first question, and if all the pictures are on one side, you can slide them over so you can see I might slide this over in case I move you. There you go. What is the goal of your teaching? That's the first question. First thing that comes to your mind, no judgment, no, you know, don't worry about, is it the right answer, whatever, just honestly what you think. And that is what I'd like you to put in the answer. So if you have the photo open on your phone and pointed at that QR code, it'll ask you, do you want to open the page? And then you can type what you want. Can be a word, can be a sentence, whatever you'd like. It's anonymous. So you don't have to worry that somebody's going to know you personally have thought this. And that's okay. So that should be easy. All right. The next one I'm going to talk about while you do that. The next one is a more tricky question with two parts. And this is, I'd like you to think of an experience you had. When is some time that you accomplished something? You were able to do something, to achieve something, but you didn't think you could do it at first. And importantly, it was your teacher who helped you. They helped you somehow. It may not have even been their attention to help you, but they did. So two parts to that question. What was the thing you did? And what was it that your teacher did to help you? And you may think, well, I don't know how to answer both of those. That's okay. If you can answer half of it, great. If you can answer the whole thing, fabulous. If you can answer the whole thing, but you're only willing to share half, that's still great. And this one, I suggest you keep open on your phone. You don't have to do right away. I'm not going to pause and wait for you. I'm going to go on and you can answer the question as I talk. So hopefully take that picture, get that page open, and I'm going to move on. Now, that video was great. And here's another thing from that same group. There is a document that is about understanding and enabling student success in higher education, put out by this very same national forum and the Higher Education Authority. And I thought it's worth mentioning this because we are in Ireland, even though I'm virtually in Ireland, and talking about education, whether you are the one at the front delivering the education, supporting education, or on the receiving end as a student being in the education programs. It's important for us, and it's really essential to understand, why do we care about this? Why are we doing this topic today? And within this document, if you were to open it up and search for the word self, you'd find it comes up quite a bit. In fact, self-efficacy comes up, but other things do too. And when we work with students, when we enable engagement, when we enhance these beliefs, there are a couple of things that happen, and they have to do with the self. We find that students are self-directed. We find they're self-motivated. They start to be self-starters. They do self-regulated learning. They enhance their self-beliefs. And then further, it explains they enhance not just their self-beliefs, but their self-efficacy and their metacognition. Now, those are big words, and we'll work on those in a minute. and increase the engagement. Now that's good for everybody concerned, for the learners, for the teachers, for the institutions, for everyone. So what is this self-efficacy stuff? There was a guy, Albert Bandura, who recently died in his 90s. He lived a very long life. He was amazing, still writing a book until he died. And he first introduced self-efficacy in 1977. And I've put the definition there. The definition is important because, well, as we'll see, words matter. Self-efficacy is your belief, a personal belief in your capabilities to accomplish a criterial task. There are two really important words in there, three actually. One is it's a person's belief, it's a personal belief. That's really important. It's not the teacher's belief, it's not some textbook's belief, it's the person's belief. The second thing is capabilities. It's not your ability, it's not your test score, it's capabilities. And your capability has to do with the not yet, has to do with the dream, the vision. It's more than now. It's what hasn't yet happened. And the criterial task is important. And in the education, we know about criteria. We have assessments, we have benchmarks, and the criteria are the qualifiers. What is it about it that's specific? Now, Bandura, when he first investigated self-efficacy, he did it in a way that actually none of us, and I'm confident in saying that, none of us will be able to do. And usually when people do a study, you want to replicate it. But he did a study with boa constrictors, with snakes. And I don't mind where you're teaching. There is no ethics board that's going to approve a study like that. It's downright scary. So, but the good thing about these studies was he said to people, how confident are you that you can, and he named different tasks, be in the same room as a snake, hold a snake. And actually, if you then produce a snake, it's really hard to fake that belief. So what he was able to do was confirm the strength of different influences. And what he found was there are four main influences on self-efficacy beliefs. The first thing is actually doing something, a mastery experience. If I make a fried egg, I know I can fry an egg because actually I've done it. It's going to be hard to convince me I can't do it once I've done it. But if I've never done it, then observing somebody else do something is going to influence me. Now, this matters how it's done, and we'll talk about that in detail later, but you can imagine if you watch the Olympics and you see somebody do one of those fantastic sports, I don't know, where they're on a BMX bike and they do 4 flips in the air and they go over something, and you think, it's not necessarily going to convince you that you can do it. It matters that the person you're observing has some similarities to you and that you understand what they're kind of doing, because otherwise it won't be very influential. Now, the third one down, and these are in order of strength, is verbal and social feedback and encouragement. It was originally called verbal persuasion. Now, this is something that happens all the time in education. We talk to people, we encourage them, we tell them, well done, you're doing all right. And this is valuable. And you can think of this order hierarchy, and it makes a lot of sense when you get to the last one. The last one is physical signs, nerves. If you were in my house right now and you held my hand, you'd find I've got cold fingers. I'm a bit nervous, but it's not going to stop me talking to you because actually I know I can talk. If I had never spoken to a group in my life and I'd never seen anybody speak and nobody had ever encouraged me to speak, I might look to my physical self and think, well, I don't know if I feel so confident, maybe I shouldn't do it. But actually, it's not going to override the other influences. So these things impact our self-beliefs. And the way they manifest themselves has to do more than just with what's inside our heads. In 1986, I'm going to take you through some historical studies and important literature. Bandura came up with the idea of social cognitive theory. And within this, he had a model for human functioning. Every day, every person, we all have these certain things that interact in our lives. And he called it a fancy thing. There was triadic reciprocity. It made a little pyramid with these 3 things of the personal influences, what I bring, my feelings, beliefs, thoughts, behavior, how I interact, what I do, and the environment, those around me, and the actual physical setting. And if you change one, it impacts the other. If I've got no heating in my house, it's going to change the way I behave, and it might change the way I think. Fortunately, the heating works today. These things work on a grand scale, and they also work on a small scale. And actually, when we start to consider our self-efficacy beliefs, they don't just reside within the personal. No one aspect of this cycle can be considered without a whole picture. And as an educator, it's very hard to figure out, well, and to know. You can't really ask someone, what do you believe about how you can do something? It may not be appropriate at all. It may be none of our business to pry into that. But through looking at the interaction of the way the personal, the behavioral, and the environmental interact, we can see evidence of people's self-efficacy beliefs. That's going to be an important one when we get to the end of my talk for how you can take it away into your teaching practice. So how was it looked at in research? There was a guy called Collins in 1982. You got to tell me, are these little squares blocking the words on the right for everybody else? Can somebody, Graham, can you tell me? No, good, because on my screen, I've got a little window of people blocking the words. That's all right then. So Collins looked at people in mathematics, education, and he figured out something really important. Typically, students get graded on their ability. In education, before higher education, you may have streamed classes. Are you in the A set or the B set? And what he figured out is if you're at the same ability level, and actually you have different beliefs about how you're going to do, you accomplish different levels. Your ability does not equal your accomplishment. Self-efficacy influences and impacts your attainment. That was really important. Now, when we look at learning, instead of labeling people as a number, if we think about learning as something that can expand and grow, that's the capability, not the ability, the capability. You'll have heard of growth mindset. Self-efficacy and actually doing things, I think, is much more than just a growth mindset, because it has to do with the metacognition, the getting there, the beliefs, the criterial task. But as teachers, that's a good starting place. And when we think of that capability to grow, it means that our students look inward. They look at themselves instead of looking at other numbers, looking at the comparison of, did I do as well as that person? Am I the same? It doesn't matter if you're the same, it matters what you might become. Now, when you start to think of where you could go, you think of how you can get there. That's where the self-starters that we heard about in that initial document starts to come into practice through self-regulated learning. Now, there are strategies for how you do things. Actions to get skills, and how you do things with goals. This is important. That then gets translated into not just strategies in an abstract form, because you can think, oh, how do I do this? It turns into a behavior. So you'll find self-regulated learning behaviors have been studied in various research studies where people have looked at what are the things that students do. They involve things like organizing and looking at how they approach material. Do you always start at the beginning and go to the end? In some things, if you read a book, it's traditional to start at the beginning and go to the end when you learn how to read. Actually, if you're writing an essay and researching, how many students are going to read the whole books? Well, you know, they might start doing that, but it's not a very effective strategy. I know my students are shocked when I tell them, don't read the whole thing, read the whole thing later. For the essay, search for key words, read the bits you need, then investigate those concepts. They say, I never knew I could do so much without reading for days. And I said, well, actually, it's about understanding what you need to do and the strategies, turning that into a self-regulated learning behavior. How are you going to carry it out? Do you need help? Do you need to seek help from external sources, printed sources? Do you need to reflect back on what you're doing? The way we organize our behaviors, the way we implement them, it depends on our confidence in our belief, in our capabilities to do these things. When we have the higher sense of, yeah, you know what? Yes, I can, then we're going to find more ways to be strategic. We're going to be less put off by little bits of failure, and we're going to be more resilient and persevere. So this is really good. Now, it matters what we do as teachers. It matters what our students think, back to that triangle, the personal, environmental, and behavioral. And if you look at this guy's face while I'm talking, you'll see what I mean. Because even when we, as teachers, as students, as support workers, have a belief that is founded on some random thing. And in this particular research study, it was called an anchor. There was a study by Cervone and Peake where they gave students a false anchor. They either told them, you're doing really well, that's amazing, or is that really all you did? And they sort of told them how they should believe about themselves. And it made an impact on their behavior. Now, I know I feel horrible when I look at that sad face, but when I look at this woman smile, instantly it's like, it sort of starts to melt off. And what that reminds me, as a teacher, as an educator, the small things that I can do, like in that first question, hope you're still writing things on that Padlet. The impact of your teacher may have been unintentional. It may have just been in their good teaching bedside manner, as it were, the way they interact with their students. It may be that they just smiled on you with kindness and didn't judge and encouraged you, despite the fact that you perhaps didn't think you could do it. What we say matters. So it's important to consider that. Now, through the decades, there have been problems with educational research, and self-efficacy is so important, and it's also so personal. And this means that it's hard to figure out. So what people have done when they do research studies is, well, if you think of a research study, usually it's kind of formal. We've got scientific method and things like that. And well, I don't know, let's fill out a questionnaire. And people invented their own questionnaires and they didn't really test them because actually we don't really all know how to do that stuff. And the problem was self-efficacy has that specific definition: personal belief, capability, specific task. Over the years, some people sort of deviated and it became, how do you feel about yourself? And sometimes people investigated wider concepts of self-belief, more self-esteem, a global concept of self. And we get warned, be careful when looking at historical research that actually it's addressing the construct, the idea of self-efficacy. Otherwise, take it with a grain of salt. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no hope. We do have advice on how to go about investigating this stuff. And some of it is pretty formal, and others are good, simple advice. Now, there's a chapter in there by Bandura, the guy who invented the concept. And there's also a really good chapter by Mimi Bong. And the reason I point out these two chapters in specific is because I know I was surprised that a book called Self-Efficacy Beliefs of Adolescence was the thing to look at to figure out how to question the stuff. Because it doesn't say a guide to questioning self-efficacy and doing your own research, understanding it. It says adolescence. I don't necessarily work with adolescents, not mainly, but that's a really good book. So I commend it to you. Now, my own stuff, my whole research, I wanted to make sure I didn't fall into the trap of looking at the wrong concept. And so I did start with questionnaires and I tested them really a lot. And I did a lot of homework on how do you go about testing these things. And this that you see is my questionnaire for performing. And one of the things I did is I separated self-efficacy because some people said, how do you feel about self-efficacy for music or sports? And actually, we do a lot of different things in each of our domains. And so I separated learning and performing. And especially in music, that makes perfect sense because what do? You sit in a practice room and practice, practice, practice. And then you stand up on a concert in a fancy outfit and you perform. It's a very different thing. And actually, they're not the same. So I made up different questionnaires and I tested them. Now, I've also moved on from testing questionnaires. In the questionnaires, they're really useful. And I showed things like the more expertise you have, the more your self-efficacy influences your achievement, the more you understand the task you're doing, the more it influences your achievement, the more you stick with it, and how self-efficacy is related to those self-regulated learning behaviors. And I started thinking, actually, it's involved with metacognition, the thinking about thinking, and that's what I've been studying recently. But I moved away from questionnaires. I still use them, but I also now get people to describe that confidence in their beliefs so that I have a version of a number and some words. And I did some fancy testing with semantic processing to show that actually we can translate the words to show the same stuff as the numbers, but we don't want to just have words so they deviate and become a sort of fluffy thing. So I use kind of both. And I did a couple of recent studies looking at how students were impacted by COVID and having to suddenly take on board alternate assessments. That had to do with learning new skills, things like recording themselves at home, making sure that they could do things. Well, how did the environment impact them, the space, their thinking? How did they go about those self-regulated learning processes? And goals for the general public. So I took it away from education as well and said, actually, in your life, what were the things you really aimed to do? And how was that impacted? What are you going to do about it, to see how do people think about what's most important to them? And I did another validation study because, you know, I like to keep testing questionnaires and make sure they're okay. I also wrote some books. So I've got an education book, and these are the topics in the table of contents. Hopefully that's not too boring. But this one is written for teachers, but it's readable by everybody. But if you're a teacher, it's going to be really relevant. And it starts with, what's the context of our teaching? What are the good points? What are the bad points? Let's look at it. And how does that, say a lecture theater, fit with a whole student? And that triangle thing, you can't neglect the whole student. How do we communicate? How does that impact self-efficacy? How can we do this in practical ways in the classroom? And this isn't a music book, by the way, it's all everybody. And then how can we develop mastery experiences? This is kind of a how-to book in education. Then this year, I wrote another one, and this is the one that if you want a copy, I can give you a few. So tweet me, and I've got some audiobooks I can give away. And this one is also used for full educators. It's useful for anyone. This one's not a music book even, although I've got a picture of me playing my cello at 6 in the morning because that was the only time I could practice, because I had multiple people, grown-ups and children living in my house, and we all worked at home and studied at home, and it got kind of crowded. So I was in the shed practicing because that's where my office was then. So the way I teach, though, is what this book is about. And this book exemplifies the learning and teaching process. So if you're an educator, you'll get a lot more out of it and get things that are different than the general public would get out of it. I teach through parable, through a storytelling voice, and through experience. Basically, in this, you've got chapters of me demonstrating some success, some challenges, taking on board new skills, and some pretty drastic failures. And what I did, how things impacted me, and how they relate to other people. And they go from everything from things people in the hall when I was a teenager would say, you know, what does your peer say to you, to driving my son to school, to baking a cake and profiteroles, and, you know, being out in the garden and watching the sunrise, ordinary things. So self-efficacy for me is actually the key to everything. And I'm very keen that it is integrated into everything we do, especially our classroom and education. So I thought I should give you 5 steps for you for your teaching. And I've got here a fantastic star that I drew, because PowerPoint doesn't do these. So we've got create opportunities, learn with your students, ask questions, feed growth, and again, reflection. I'll talk you through each of these. Now, in your teaching, creating opportunities, I'd like to propose whatever your class is, you've got a teaching class, and then at the end, probably you have an assessment, because actually, if it's higher education, you have to have some sort of grade that says the student passed the course. Even if it's only pass fail, there will be something that demonstrates their achievement. Very often, that is very different to the course. An example, I teach a course on a certain period of music history, and it is, I don't know, dealing with 50, 60 years of dead guys doing stuff, and it's historical. Well, they're not actually learning a skill. They're not going to demonstrate that. And at the end, they write an essay. In the course, I'm talking about all sorts of stuff. Very often in the course, the assessment doesn't necessarily match what happens in the weeks. I can create opportunities for my students to practice the skills they need for their assessment to help integrate some of the material they are learning week by week in ways that can help them gain some confidence. Now, for you, whatever it is you do, think through what it is you're asking of your students. What are you teaching them? What are you requiring of them? What are you hoping they get out of it? And Yes, for the assessment, that will mean what is the criteria? What are the criteria? What is the task you're asking? What do they need to do that task? Does that relate to the things that go on every week? And if it does, fantastic. How can you enhance that? If it doesn't, how can you drip feed some of that in? Are there lacks of opportunities, things that could get in the way? Are there things that could get in the way from the way the class is constructed? Is it a huge lecture class? And actually, it's really hard to get people to do things individually. Can you create small groups? Can you use things that students are good at and make some sort of a chat forum where they have to come up with something and discuss? Can they write little things and share? What are the things that they already know that they could contribute to this? It's up to you. Think of how you can create opportunities for involvement, and it's going to be different for each of us. The second one is learning with them. And for this, modeling and talking it out. That first one was about mastery experiences, those 4 main influences. This one focuses on the second. So the second was the vicarious learning, observing. And actually, if you're the teacher, if I'm the one speaking, you're looking at me, whether it's me you're actually looking at or the information, I'm part of it. So as you explain to your students, instead of simply delivering the information, think about how you might be able to frame it in a way that helps them understand the processes. Now, this can seem foreign to some people, it can seem risky. And basically what it means is you have to expose yourself as a learner. Now, that doesn't mean you have to take on board something that you've never done and genuinely be fearful and, oh no, I haven't made the progress this week. You can be acting. So you might, in essence, pretend you could open yourself up, show them all the thought process you hope that they'll undertake, but talk them through it. Because when somebody is new to something, sometimes they don't even know what they're supposed to be thinking. Sometimes we forget that we have to help people learn how to learn, not just learn the material. So learning these processes can be really important. The thinking about thinking, that's metacognition. And those skills are really important. Once you have those, you can apply them to the self-regulated learning behaviors and then learn to do it yourself. So asking your students all the way through, asking the right questions has to do with making them active partners in the learning process. It's not something done to them. It's not something they just observe. Now we want them active. So draw them in and reflect, get them to reflect. What are they seeing? What are they doing? How are they doing their tasks that you've created, the opportunities? Reflecting while they're doing them, reflecting, looking back on them, reflecting on the actions they're doing, and you as an outsider, reflecting on them to highlight the processes that you hope they'll notice for themselves. Sometimes in this reflection process, it's really important to be honest and simply say, actually, you know what? I can see that you're a bit stuck and it's hard. It takes time. Keep going with this. And let's think about something, something, something. Just knowing that it's not all supposed to be easy can be really encouraging and actually help someone feel validated and that their self-efficacy isn't ill-founded. Feedback is really important. And at the end of this couple of hours this morning, I'm sure you'll be asked for your feedback on how was the session? How were the speakers? Do you have some takeaways? That's really valuable. The traditional feedback at the end is essential. It would be ridiculous if you walked into a restaurant and they asked you, how was your meal before you ordered? You have to actually have the experience to know what you're thinking. But feedback can happen all the way along as well. Because if you think about your getting from A to B, it might not be just A to B, it might be A to 273, and you've gone through some letters and transitioned to numbers, and actually you can stop along the way. Notice where you are, look back, look ahead. That kind of feedback, feed forward, just feeding the hunger to learn is going to help your students. It's going to reinforce and reiterate the processes and really help them to know what they're doing. So it's a way of teaching and learning in action. And lastly, we got to do it again. Remember that triadic reciprocity in the everyday functioning of human behavior. Well, it's the same with building self-efficacy. Reflection is so important. And if you imagine the star, you've seen these little triangles in the corner, they kind of spin round. You can imagine it's like a wheel. You've got to keep it going. Self-efficacy is not something you get once, like a fancy stamp, and then you've got it and you can hang it on the wall. It's for one task at one time with you as the person you are on that day. On another day, in another time, in another place, you'll have to reassess yourself, your beliefs, and think again. If we can reinforce the processes, know that we have the skills, the capabilities, keep encouraging students to reflect and have these different ways to substantiate their beliefs, then they will be able to repeatedly achieve and will make it a good thing. And keep circling back. Now, I'm going to leave you with a nice picture of a cat, because who can avoid having a nice cat? And besides, it's all about you, whether you're the teacher, whether you're the learner. Self-efficacy is about the self. As the teacher, remember, you may be in the driving seat of leading your learners, but it's about them. And these cats were made by a very nice educator called Laura Gibbs. She made me 24 cats when I did the academic book, and they're on Flickr. They're quite nice. So I'm hoping I didn't go over too much, and I hope to hear about your Padlets. I have one totally inappropriate slide because it's so small. Oops, I went back. These are all the references. I know it's too small, but it's being recorded, so you can take a screenshot and then go find all the things that I mentioned. And there's some contact details. I'm very happy to be in touch with any or all of you about anything you might have as a question. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Wow, Laura, that was amazing. Thank you so much. A round of applause, without a doubt. Thank you, Laura. A lot in there and a lot for us to digest. I've got a lot of comments, questions myself. So perhaps maybe we can have a look at those Padlets, and I can look through the chat as well.
Yeah, so shall I share my screen and find those Padlets?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, please.
That's super fun. I'm going to find the Padlets. There we are. Okay, so this is what's the goal of your teaching. We've got support the achievement of aspirations. That's really nice. Reach and teach all. Impart information through thoughts, ideas, and theories, helping students to learn, make teaching and learning accessible, promote learning, empowerment, educating, inquiry, transfer of knowledge, feeling welcome. That's really nice. Teachers to express their unwavering belief in their ability. This has completely changed my attitude towards my own confidence. That's really interesting. Help students get excited. Wow, I like that one. Change the lives. It doesn't sound trite at all, because actually as teachers, we get to do so much. And it's funny because the students might forget you, as in you're not going to be their best friend. They're going to ring up, but they will remember you, and create a frame of mind, sharing the knowledge, build confidence, helping them. Those are wonderful. That's amazing. And then let's look at, can you identify something? Oh, wow. Okay, positive encouragement to achieve my own goals as opposed to just achieving a grade that's considered a success. Love that. There was to do many things I felt I couldn't. Research, public speaking, fortunate to meet teachers who insisted I could. So I did. Teachers saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. That is so true. I've had that. When I went with instinctive response, and it was, instinctive, I think, response, and it was well received. I had a teacher who had a very mentoring style, helped me with difficult topics, business, economics, taught me I can do what the hashtag says. It's amazing. Teacher told me her story and made me realize I was not alone. Yeah. The good feedback helped to guide me. Parallel parking. Awesome. Sat with me. They sat with me. Now that is a wonderful one, because sometimes it's not doing a fancy thing, but it's just being there. A lecture really changed things second year by giving me specific and thoughtful feedback. Doing maths, teacher calmed me down. Patience, the teacher believed in me. 3 experiences last year. Late for class, and the teachers mentioned my name in a good way when talking about the students. I felt good and I enjoyed the lessons more. Reward for hard work and assessment and feedback, and additional help when they spent extra time to help you understand a concept. Those are all amazing. They're brilliant.
Yeah, they're
really,
thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing those. They're great. So you can revisit those Padlets. You can still add things. And let's see, are there questions?
Part of a reflection. Yeah, they're part of a reflection, aren't they, Laura? Yeah. Some very positive comments here in the chat coming in. I think the self-efficacy cats has become a thing, Laura, just to let you know.
Yay.
Yeah, just a quick question, because there's some comments about reflection, and you mentioned that a few times, Laura, which I'm also a believer of reflection, but I think there's kind of maybe, is there some challenge to asking students to kind of formally reflect? And do you have any recommendations on maybe how to approach that?
Yeah, well, one thing that I know my personal thing is that I often ask students, I don't require them to share things, just like on the Padlets. There are, well, let's see, about 50 people here, and we have we don't have 50 reflections. We got lots of things on the Padlets. It doesn't mean that you have to, but I would venture to say that most people thought about the questions. Just because you don't have a public display of the learning that I can see right now as the teacher doesn't mean it's not happening. The students will have to do whatever that end of something assessment is, and that you can require. The reflection along the way you can encourage. And I often demonstrate with myself. There was somebody had, one of those reflections said that the teacher told them a story and they realized they weren't alone. On Monday, I had a class where students are forming their own curriculum, and it is in music. And we were focusing on how to be musical and expressive. And they all had these very abstract ideas. And I said, right, I've got a song. And my song was called On My Own from Les Mis. And one of my third-year students is teaching me to sing it. These were fourth-year students. I said, okay, I've been practicing. Help me be expressive. Shall I sing it for you? And I was the student. Now, I'm not a formally trained singer. I've got a lot of stuff they could do to help me, I promise. And I was a bit nervous in front of these people who are all doing vocal performance and teaching. And so in teaching me, it's kind of like a deflection. In deflecting it, they were able to reflect through doing, and then I could tell them what they did, which was a public reinstatement of the reflection. If you're able to get a discussion going, you can often then summarize it as a physical representation of the reflections that happened, which reflections can be translated in that way as the engagement. The engagement was the what's happening. So it doesn't have to be a threatening, self-exposing thing. And but if you do want to get them thinking deeper, I find the way is by me either actually showing them how to do something or playing the part of talking through doing it. And then they see it's not so scary, I'm not alone. And actually there's a benefit to figuring out these principles and processes. Does that help?
Excellent. Yeah, really, really helpful, Laura. Thanks for the tips on that, because I think there was some comments on that, and certainly it was one of my own questions as well. There's one question I would ask you, Laura. I'm going to put you on the spot if you really don't mind now. It's just back to the Padlet questions. Can you identify a time that you achieved something that you didn't initially think you could do, and perhaps maybe there was somebody there that provided that support for you?
Yeah, I think I had a lot of feisty things, and there's I was very fortunate. In May, I did a TEDx talk, and I put my teacher on the spot, and I'm not sure what he thinks of it. But he told me I'd never be a soloist at one point as a musician cellist, and he didn't mean it at all, but it was his way of saying, like, yeah, you're really going to do this? I wonder if you can do this. And he gave me every single opportunity and really pushed me. But I thought, you know what? Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not going to do this. Maybe I can't do that. And the thing that was really important for me was the lesson that, you know, when you're very small and they say, what are you going to be when you grow up? And you say, I'm going to be this. And you name an astronaut or something. That thing, it doesn't mean that you're not going to do. Obviously, you may not be the astronaut, but I was still a soloist, but I'm not the person. That's not the only thing I do. And I don't go around the world only playing my cello. But I have figured out that I can, it was the figuring out in a wider way that I can do things. And sometimes it's just the simple word. The thing that's most encouraged me has been when people have said something without it being required. So like if you're required formal feedback, I know the teacher has to tell me what I've done well, what I need to do to improve and give me a grade. It's when somebody says something that I'm not quite expecting, like somebody reflected that somebody said what they couldn't see. With this book, that the recent one, the reason I wrote that was because a colleague said to me, we were having a conversation, he said to me, why haven't you written this as a book? And I went, I could write a book. It might be worth writing a book. Oh my gosh. But I never thought that it was either that it was worth it or that I could necessarily do it. And then I just did it. So.
Well, it's certainly worth it. And thank you for doing that. And I liked what you said there, Laura. I think it's that kind of the way we can transfer that belief, isn't it, into other things, you know. So if you achieve something, it's like, well, maybe I can look at other things in my life as well. And as you say, I might not be the astronaut.
It doesn't have to be predefined exactly the way you think, because when you're starting out, you don't necessarily have the skills to understand all the facets of what the end product is. When you start a degree, you don't know what being a vet or being a counselor or being a something really involves. You've got an idea, but that will grow and develop as you learn more.
Mm. Well, Laura, thank you very much. There will be some time, by the way, just to let the audience know. Laura's going to stay with us, of course, and there will be more time later on, actually, so for to address some questions, and we might go back to Padlet again. So feel free to keep posting those questions. We do need to move on, unfortunately. We'd love to keep talking to you like this, Laura. So next up is actually just myself. So before we do that, just another round of applause actually for Laura, because that was excellent. Thank you very much. So next up is myself. It's a very short presentation, I hope. I'll get through it in terms of the main bits and pieces. And it's just essentially, I suppose, how I came across the concept of self-efficacy through my own investigation as part of my doctoral studies. So I hope you find it relevant, perhaps those perhaps in practice and the application of self-efficacy. So let me go ahead and do that. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So I hope you can see my screen there. Is that coming up okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I suppose my background is in computing, and I'm a computing lecturer. And I don't actually teach computer programming, but through my own interaction with students, a common problem that they discussed, even in my class or in the corridors or outside the institution, was programming is a nightmare. It's really difficult. I don't get it. And in my classes, a lot of the time what I was doing was I was encouraging group work, encouraging students to interact and share their understanding of different things we were looking at. But what I found is that in computer programming, that this really isn't or wasn't a concept that was welcomed, if anything, and perhaps was seen as a negative thing to include in a programming class, because there was a perception in terms of the people that I talked to across the sector that, you know, you either can program or you can't. And this was an interesting statement that I wanted to take up and say, well, let me make that my challenge. Even though, as I said, I'm not a programming lecturer, I wanted to challenge that concept and see what I could do with these students. So this is a small piece in a larger study. It was an action research study that I did over 3 years, but I've just taken out this slice because of its relevancy to today's event, of course. So of course, this is what we put on the brochures, that we create this beautiful harmony in class, everyone happy on their laptops working away, and it's full of joy. And the reality, of course, particularly in computing classes, is this, and the bring your own device concept is very welcomed, but it does create challenge. And as you can see here, it's a very busy room. There are lots of students, and as a lecturer, you're trying to gauge the interaction and engagement in terms of what you're talking about. And even just quick observation, you can see some students here smiling away down the bottom, but directly beside them, their neighbors maybe not looking so happy. So what's going on there? We have a student, unfortunately, perhaps who didn't bring their laptop in today, or maybe it's being repaired or something. And we have a student here who's left the room. So this can happen, of course. So what do we do about this situation? And you know, one of the methods that I would recommend those in practice look at is observation. And what I actually did is I planted myself at the back of some of the classrooms within the institution, just to see what was going on behind the screens. And this is an example of a classroom where the lecturer, being at the front, is seeing all of these faces in the back of the laptop, but actually what's happening there is students working away on different things and not necessarily focused on the lecture at hand. So again, with technology, when perhaps things are getting a little bit more difficult, the distractions are there, and it's very dangerous because we can connect into other things and work away. And I think we know that from our own lives. And the reason why I'm saying that is because computer programming is hard. It is difficult. It's not an easy thing to pick up. And for a lot of students, it might take a year or even 2 years before they have that eureka moment. And in lots of other subjects, that happens a lot earlier. So it is a challenge and it is difficult. And when you kind of have an enforced individualistic approach to programming, you're just compounding the problem, because students then feel that they can't reach out to others to express perhaps the challenges that they have. So this was a key focus of my particular study. So I was interested, I suppose, primarily kind of more in a broader sense as to why do students drop out in the first place, and what about those, you know, who genuinely want to engage in the process, but they just can't keep up with the pace of the learning in the classroom. So again, through looking at lots of different literature, these are just some examples. What I did find was the importance of social integration. And also, of course, of self-efficacy, which is a key part to my study as well. And I looked at theories from Bandura and, of course, Vygotsky, another well-known author, of course, in the area, and self-efficacy, as Laura has described. And I was fascinated by this concept, your belief in your ability, your capability to do something, and how much that impacts the next thing you do. And I found that fascinating. And then, of course, you know, how could I bring that into the classroom? How could I make that part of somebody's learning? So I suppose one of my questions in the broader research was, you know, can social learning activities enhance computer programming self-efficacy? So I suppose my mission wasn't necessarily to you know, have an output of these amazing programmers that were going to change industry. It was just to get them to come to the table and to engage. And that was very important for me, and to say, look, you can, you know, and that was a key aspect of what I was doing. But it wasn't a focus on performance as such, as in assessment grades and things like that. So again, as Laura has pointed out, Bandura here is on to my right here on the screen, and of course very influential in my study, but also, of course, was Vygotsky and a lot of his theories in his work. I really like this quote: "The true direction of the development of thinking is not from the individual to the social, but from the social to the individual," which kind of really connects to what we were talking about with the importance of reflection and interaction, that we talk to people, then we come back and have time for ourselves to think about what we said, what am I going to say next, and we go back into the social circle and deliver that, and vice versa, you know. So this relationship is very, very important. And equally, Bandura here, accomplishment is socially judged by ill-defined criteria, so that one has to rely on others to find out how one is doing. So again, underscoring that social interaction, which is innate in terms of us in establishing our efficacy and so on and so forth. So in terms of social learning, between, I suppose, Vygotsky and Bandura and others, I kind of pulled out what I would consider kind of practical things, because this was very much a practice-based piece of research. So I was kind of looking at theories and saying, well, how do I apply them? And there were a number of things that kind of jumped out from the literature, and Vygotsky's work on the more knowledgeable other concept, and this other concept called the zone of proximal development, were very practical in terms of saying, right, these are things I can actually bring into the classroom and challenge that concept of the individualistic approach to teaching programming. And then, of course, social learning theory, and as Laura has already pointed out, social cognitive theory, which is what Bandura renamed it as in terms of his own theory. Again, underscoring the importance of reflection is in there. I just put in this last piece here, non-assessed group work, because when we use the concept of group work, there seems to be kind of a gasp of, oh no, I can't believe it, we're doing more group work, you know, I don't like group work and all of that kind of thing. But this is fundamentally not true. Students love working with each other. They go to college to have that peer interaction. The problem is when we put assessment on everything. So it's a group project and here's the grade. And this is what people have a fear of primarily. But when you introduce group work and don't assess it, it creates a different dynamic. And I would suggest that anyone who's thinking about introducing group work, well, introduce it in this way, you know, don't assess it. Get people to talk together, interact and work on something. But there's no grade that's going to be applied to the module overall weighting or whatever it might be. And that worked very, very successfully for me, which I suppose you'll see now in a second in terms of what I did. I just pulled out this quick screen just to show you what I meant by some of those theories. Sometimes you can look at theories and they can be very, very abstract, or concepts that can be very, very abstract. This kind of stood out as something, you know, very obvious and saying, okay, this is what I can do in the center. And then how do I get to what I can't do? And after talking to the students, the ones that were telling me that programming is not for them, and, you know, they didn't like it, and you know, they were really struggling. They were literally saying from, this is what I can do right now, but I definitely can't do that. So where was the middle ground? And this zone of proximal development developed by Vygotsky was very helpful to me in saying, this is something that I can work with. So how can I support the students in this part here to essentially get them to, well, actually, I can do. So this was very important. So in terms of just to give you the background, the students that I was focusing on were first year IT students. They were in their second semester. They were naturally formed groups. So we had a group A and a group B. So two different classes, if you will, studying the same subject with the same teacher. They were international students. We had, I suppose, a higher percentage of Brazilian students, but we had a lot of different nationalities represented across the student body. So I invited both of the groups to participate in the research, and Group A was identified as the treatment group. So they were going to receive this treatment, and again, essentially the social learning activities, and Group B were going to be the control group. So I actually used a mixed methods approach. It's a little bit like what Laura was talking about as well. So I needed tools to, of course, introduce what is social learning. How do I bring that into the classroom in a kind of a structured way? And I looked at problem-based learning. And problem-based learning is, I suppose it's a known method of introducing problems into groups and getting them to figure it out over a long period of time in a lot of cases. So, you know, you can have a fairly long problem-based learning project. So I looked at that model and said, okay, so I wanted to have more of a kind of a quick win, a better reaction from students that they could feel at the end of a class even. So I kind of created a hybrid model of problem-based learning. I made it much shorter, so that there was something that they could actually leave and reflect on, but also build their efficacy. I thought that was very, very important. Again, thinking about the concept of dropout, I wanted to make sure that we interacted with the students as early as possible in the semester and build that efficacy. And I also looked at peer-assisted learning, which was less formal and less structured perhaps. And this was kind of maybe students teaming up in twos or threes to work through their own particular problems. And that, of course, were the two particular approaches that I used in my study. I needed a tool to measure self-efficacy, and I was delighted to hear Laura talking about the self-measurement tool, of course, that Bandura created. So I also adopted that tool. Probably not as rigorous as yourself, Laura, in terms of re-examining that questionnaire, but nevertheless, it worked, and it worked effectively well for me. We'll have a quick look at that now in a second. I needed to gather feedback, of course, from the participants, and I did introduce the qualitative feedback forms, which were very insightful outside of the quantitative data. So again, this was students telling me, reflecting essentially what they felt about the activity and their understanding of it. And that was very useful as a way of gathering feedback as well on these activities. So again, you know, in terms of problem-based learning and peer-assisted learning, what I was trying to achieve here was these pieces on the left here. So how do I get these students to interact? What were the group sizes going to be? Were they randomized? And I had to reflect on that approach as well and consider those particular approaches, and literally to get away from what was happening, which was the teacher at the top of the room and everyone with their laptop working individually. And this is what I wanted to avoid at all costs. So again, that's why the problem-based learning and peer-assisted learning approaches were considered. Just very quickly, in terms of problem-based learning, and I would suggest, you know, if you're going to consider using problem-based learning, you know, feel free to customize it in terms of your audience, you know, your particular groups of students. But I suppose in essence, what I wanted to show here is that what I liked about problem-based learning is that if I had 5 students that were working on a problem in computer programming, they didn't all have to program. They didn't all have to straight away, you know, understand how to code. It meant that some of the students who perhaps had disengaged from programming, maybe in that first semester and were struggling, they could still interact with the group in a different way. So we, you know, in this example here, you have a scribe who, this is somebody who just records the points made by the groups, perhaps participates in the discussion, maybe writes up the notes, but they're still interacting with each other and they're learning from each other. And this also builds efficacy. So again, as Laura's pointed out, you know, you're observing other people coding and suddenly you feel part of something. So that's what I really liked about problem-based learning. So again, as I said, you know, consider customizing this in terms of your particular audience. I certainly would recommend doing that. So this is my beautiful questionnaire that I created, which is based on the Bandura questionnaire model. And I came up with 26 questions which were informed by the students and by the lecturers. So we went back and forth a little bit in terms of a pilot test to make sure that we had questions that the students could answer, that essentially that they could measure. And I also included, so you'll see these are very technical programming questions, but towards the end of the questionnaire, I actually added in some bonus questions. These were for me, and these questions were to do with group work. I wanted to find out if they believed that they were better at working in groups with regards to computer programming. I wanted to investigate that a little bit more. So I put in some questions at the end, which weren't specifically talking about actual programming skill, but just the ability to work in a group, because I wanted to find that out as part of the study. So this is what I did. And you don't need to read this, I can just talk you through it. Essentially, this was the treatment group. So this particular group received all of the activities. These were problem-based learning activities and peer-assisted learning activities. So this particular group received these activities probably just over a month, right? And we had maybe 5 activities that the students participated in. And this was a combination, as I said, of problem-based learning and peer-assisted learning. And we identified student mentors within this particular study, and they were very helpful as they moved around the group. And they kind of acted as this concept of the more knowledgeable other, and were excellent at facilitating the session. And that peer interaction was very valuable. So the mentors were amazing and a significant part of this particular study. And at the very end then, I asked them at the start to self-measure their self-efficacy with regard to programming, that previous slide with the 26 questions. And at the very end, I gave them the exact same questionnaire and said, now complete this again. And off they did, and they did that. With the control group, so this was a slightly smaller group, maybe 50 students. And of that, I had a very high completion rate for the questionnaire. I gave them the exact same questionnaire at the start of the semester. They had no problem-based learning or peer-assisted learning sessions at all in the center. And at the very end, I gave them the exact same questionnaire again, the self-efficacy questionnaire. And again, I wanted to see if there was any differences between the two groups and did the actual activities have any impact at all. So what I ended up with was this. So this is a comparison of the two groups, the ones that received the treatment and those that did not. So the control group at the start of the semester had a higher self-efficacy with regard to those group-related questions. Now I am only zooming in here on the group-related questions just for this particular presentation. But we can see here, this red line represents the control group. So they had a higher self-efficacy in their ability to work in groups regarding programming projects. And this line here, this blue line, represents the treatment group. And as you can see, of course, they had a lower, let's say slightly lower self-efficacy with regard to the same question. So after introducing the various problem-based learning and peer-assisted learning activities, issued the same questionnaire at the end of the semester. And what I found was this: the treatment group had now outperformed the control group in all of those group-related questions. So this perhaps was the most obvious positive finding of my study, which meant something was going on here. Of course, there's lots of other contributory factors when we think about a semester-long type study. So I do take that on board. But nevertheless, this is certainly evidence that something positive was happening with the treatment group on receipt of those particular problem-based learning and peer-assisted learning sessions. Yeah. So what about grades? Of course, the big question was, yeah, but you did all of this stuff with the students, did you harm them? Did it distract them from their assessment? Well, the good news is that the treatment group did slightly better than the control group. And I mean that in the sense of not causing them harm. So the engaging in the activities didn't harm them. And that was probably the most important thing. And the control group just slightly lower in terms of the average grade, but again, had performed quite well overall. So summary of the outcomes. So a lot of positive things came out of this particular study. And as I said at the start, observation is a really important approach to research. And although I didn't formalize that in my work, I would certainly recommend it in future, because although I had evidence from the self-efficacy measurement scales that something good was happening, I had the qualitative feedback forms, which are also very compelling, that the students liked this activity. Just observing the room was totally different. The energy and the excitement from the students working together in non-graded work, really want to stress that. They were getting nothing for this. There was no marks. And the students would all turn up. They'd be there after class, interacting, talking to each other. The lecturers were surprised to see this as well. So it was a major success. And from that, we actually developed our own student mentoring academy, which is still in place today and going very, very, very strong. And just as a side note to that, one of the mentors within that particular study at the time went on actually to assisted in classes in terms of lecturing, and went on himself to become a lecturer. He might be here today. We can give him a shout out. And the second thing I'd say here is that because of the positive reaction from the students, and I want to stress that the students came back to us and said, we want more of this. We then developed projects at capstone level in our level 7, level 8, and master's levels programs. So we have a lot of group-based projects now within our programs. And of course, what I would say is they require a lot of facilitation, but there's a lot of positives that can be achieved through group work. So yes, a very positive experience with the use of self-efficacy. So that's my summary. I hope it wasn't too much and you benefited maybe something from that. Very happy to talk to anyone about this, even outside of this particular session. Very happy to send more work on that. So thank you. And there is a little bit of a slide there as well on references. But that is my piece of work. So thank you very much for your attention through that. So as I said, a little bit later on, we can come back to questions that you might have. Very, very happy to take them as well. But what we need to do is move forward, and let's go and do that. So let's see what we have next. Of course, it is indeed our Dr. Maura Mcguire, who is Head of Learning and Teaching at Dundalk Institute of Technology. So before joining DKIT in 2008, Maura taught psychology at University of Westminster and the University of Luton. So Maura's interests include, of course, academic writing, assessment and feedback, professional development, and student engagement. So Maura is also editor of the All-Ireland Journal of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. And Maura is going to provide us with a practice-based talk on self-efficacy in reading and writing. Looking forward to this, Maura. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Graham. I'm just going to share my screen, which is something I tend to have low self-efficacy for, owing to various things going wrong. But wait till we... Can you see it?
It's coming. Yeah, we can see it now, Maura. Perfect.
It's self-efficacy as opposed to anything else.
Self-efficacy in action, Maura.
Okay.
That's what it is. Brilliant. Thank you.
Right, I'm just going to start this now. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to be here, and I'm just thrilled to be following two such really amazing talks on self-efficacy. I'm going to talk a wee bit about self-efficacy in academic reading and writing, which is an area that I've been interested in for a very, very long time. So I'm just going to... I suppose we often think about academic reading and writing within the context of the transition to higher education, which is something we've been thinking a lot about in Ireland and the UK over the past few years, and doing a lot of work to promote good transitions. And we know that they're really complex. It's a really ongoing process. So it is more akin to taking to the road on a journey than just stepping through a door. And we know that the belonging is really important, how to develop and foster a sense of belonging. And academic reading and writing in most disciplines are really important in this. Academic reading and writing are important routes for students to find a sense of belonging, to feel that, okay, this is, I fit here and I can do this. And academic reading and writing are also the key ways through which students start to engage with their discipline. So it's through reading that students come to know the knowledge base of the discipline, and they come to understand how knowledge is constructed and see what counts as knowledge in history or psychology or biochemistry, and how do we talk about it, and how is it constructed, how is it created. And then it's through writing that students often start to work out their own ideas, start to grapple with this disciplinary knowledge, start to put it together to see how it fits. And they usually write about their reading. So the two are very, very much intertwined. And while reading can be a fairly invisible activity, it can become very public then through students' writing. And of course, in many disciplines, written assessment is a very dominant form of assessment. So academic writing becomes the way through which students also demonstrate their competence in the discipline and demonstrate that they've met the learning outcomes. So they're really important practices, but they're complex literary practices, and they may be unfamiliar to students. And that's quite widely recognised with respect to academic writing now, that it's not, that students need support to grow and develop in terms of their writing. But with reading, often because it's more invisible, that can be less the case, and there can be assumption that, of course, students going to arrive able to read academically. But academic reading is at the level required in higher education is often quite different and more complex to reading that was required in school or in other areas of education. And it is very different to reading for pleasure, which is done for pleasure rather than work. We know that these practices are challenging. And one thing I wanted to ask you was maybe to think about when you started your studies, what was the biggest challenge you faced in terms of academic reading or writing, and what helped you to overcome it? I can remember starting college, just really not being able to work out why rewording the lab manual wasn't enough. I really just couldn't get it, but sure, I've done all this. So I couldn't see a way to improve until I got an exceptional piece of feedback from a lecturer, and suddenly, okay, this is what I need to do. This is how I do it. So the way became clear. They're very unfamiliar practices, and we know that they are challenging. And I suppose of relevance today is the importance of students' beliefs. What students believe about themselves, about their writing, impacts on their experience of it and their engagement with it. So there's been a fair bit of research that's looked at writing self-efficacy more than reading self-efficacy, although more recently there's more work on academic reading self-efficacy. But writing self-efficacy in schools and in higher education. And so, the work has shown that there's negative associations, for example, between writing self-efficacy and plagiarism. So students who have higher self-efficacy about their writing, who feel more able to do what is needed to do well in writing, to write to the standard expected, are less likely to plagiarize. As you might expect, there's been a lot of work that's looked at the extent to which writing self-efficacy is linked to actual writing performance, but this is complicated by the fact that it's hard to measure writing performance, and studies approach it in different ways. So some studies might set specific written tasks, others might use assessment tasks or GPA as a proxy, and so on. So some work has shown that writing self-efficacy does predict writing performance. Other work shows small effects or no effect. And of course, self-efficacy is measured in different ways. And then an important variable is the temporal relationship when the self-efficacy is measured, when the task is completed, and whether the measurement of self-efficacy is specific to that specific task. So the picture is quite complex for a lot of methodological reasons, but we do know that writing self-efficacy helps to keep students writing, and reading self-efficacy helps to keep them reading, and that's really important. And I suppose particularly in terms of lifelong learning, academic reading is especially important in terms of continuing professional development, developing an evidence-based approach to practice, and so on. So I'm going to just talk briefly now about some work we've done at DKIT. I've been involved with this work with my colleagues, Bree Delahunt and Anne Everett Reynolds from the Department of Nursing, Midwifery and Early Childhood Studies. And we all had a strong interest in academic writing and more laterally academic reading. And we started this work we started about 10 years ago, and we were interested in this work because we wanted to find ways to better support our students in their writing. So some years ago, we looked at academic reading self-efficacy, academic writing self-efficacy, and other writing beliefs in first year students. And we looked at this in 2 points across the first year. So we had 77 students took part. It was more complex to match them across the year because our students have placements at different times, and we matched about half the students. What we found was that reading and writing self-efficacy were very strongly associated with each other, a very, very strong relationship between them. And they're also strongly related to authorial identity, so the sense that a student has of themselves as a writer with something to say and the ability to say it. And also strongly associated with seeing oneself as a novice. So this is an interesting variable that we took from the Harvard study of undergraduate writing, and seeing oneself as a novice. So seeing academic writing as this is a process, I'm starting, I've got a lot to learn, is a really, really positive thing. It leaves students open to developing new ways of doing things, to taking feedback on board. So the students who are higher in self-efficacy in that first year are also more likely to see themselves as a novice. Interestingly, reading and writing self-efficacy were associated with deep and strategic learning strategies, but not with surface learning strategies. So the students who were higher in reading and writing self-efficacy also reported higher levels of deep and strategic, what am I saying? Strategic learning strategies. As you would expect, we found considerable variability among students. So mature students reported higher reading and writing self-efficacy than did the younger students. We'd also found in that the students on the professional nursing and midwifery programs reported higher levels of self-efficacy than students on other programs, and that was possibly related to the fact that at the time those students had a specific module that covered academic writing. We didn't find changes in self-efficacy over the first year, although we did see a change in that students were more likely to see themselves as a novice at this at time two. So that's not surprising. They'll have had more time to get some feedback, maybe to realise that the expectations perhaps were different, or to understand the expectations more fully. So that was the only change that we saw. Other research has shown that writing self-efficacy can drop in second year, typically as the writing tasks become more challenging. So we continued to look at academic writing, and I suppose quite particularly at the development of authorial identity, and more recently at academic reading. And it's really clear that certainly for our students, the development of academic reading and writing are closely intertwined, and students use their reading to inform their writing in two ways. They use it to develop the critical analysis, to think about a subject critically, but they also use the texts as examples and look at how authors construct texts and then are able to use them in their own text. Our students, our interviews with our students in a number of studies have really highlighted that for writing to develop, and we've been interested in how writing develops, over the years in students, that reading, opportunities to practice and feedback are crucial. And those are the key things that students identified in developing what we would call writing capital. So the skills, resources and knowledge to write effectively to achieve the outcomes that the students want to achieve. And we've also found that for our students, they need both the why and the how. And a lot of writing research identified how focusing on the how too much, focusing on technical skills, and the mechanics of writing could undermine engagement with writing and lead to things like an excessive concern with unintentional plagiarism and so on. And that prompted a shift to, looking more at why, looking at expectations, thinking about scholarly conversations and so on. But what we found with our students was, although the whys was very effective, our students also had a big hunger for the how. And this did seem to be related to wanting to develop competence and the need to master particular skills and feeling anxious about this. So in particular skills early on, like referencing, like paraphrasing, and like being able to understand the use of sources. So we found that a combination of the two has been more effective for our students. So this has informed student support. So the support that we offer students, for example, through the Student Learning Development Centre here at DKIT, where we provide a lot of support for academic writing. We developed induction activities called Finding Your Academic Voice, and this has been developed into learning resources as well. It's informed curriculum design on those programs, the design of specific modules, and it's also informed the design of a short course we offer, Certificate in Higher and Professional Learning, which is a kind of a short course specifically in academic writing, maybe for people who are returning to higher level study, people working professionally who perhaps haven't studied for a while or are coming through RPL routes. And it's also informed professional development that we offer and supporting writing, for supporting student writing. So just to think about some practical ways that we've taken away from this. And Laura gave a beautiful explanation of the sources of self-efficacy, and the most important of them is mastery experience. So actually doing something helps you to believe you can do it again, do it better, do it in a bigger way. So it's really important that students have opportunity to practice, and as Laura said, finding those opportunities is hugely important. There's lots of ways we can work in little opportunities to practice. Small, informal, non-threatening writing activities can be really effective, and they allow students to get a chance to try something really specific, get feedback, and also very early on offer students a chance to succeed. Yes, I was able to find an article using this database. I was able to reference it. I was able to briefly summarize it. So those opportunities to practice and to succeed. So feedback is really important here. And to support the students in setting goals, because academic writing is a complex process. It's really challenging for all of us. So nobody's going to come into college and, well, maybe some people are, and they're really, really lucky, but most of us don't start off able to write a really excellent journal article, for example. So thinking about the goals to set, and thinking about good process goals to set, how to approach writing. We've talked about vicarious experience and the need to have identifiable models. And this is where partnering with other students can be really effective. It can be so helpful for students to hear from other students about how they've overcome challenges in their writing, how their writing has changed and developed, how they approach specific writing tasks. It can be also helpful for you yourself to share experience and challenging experiences and how you overcame them and relate to your own experience as a student. Exemplars can be good here, but again, and just as Laura had mentioned, the exemplars do need to be identifiable. So sometimes if they're incredibly polished and absolutely excellent, they might undermine self-efficacy rather than build it. But useful exemplars, and something that we find quite useful, is the example of a draft. So this was a draft of the essay, this is the finished essay. So showing that writing is a messy process. It's not going to look perfect. One of the things about writing is it can look great or okay at the end, but it's looked terrible. It's been a real mess generally to get there. And that can be, because that's invisible, the messiness of the process can feel quite undermining unless students expect that and are given permission to say, that's okay, that's as it should be. Verbal persuasion, again, verbal persuasion from lecturers in particular would be seen as a very credible source of encouragement and support. So that's supportive, specific feedback is really important here. And the internal states, we know that anxiety undermines self-efficacy, stress undermines self-efficacy. So anything we can do to reduce that will help. So by clarifying expectations, being clear with assessed work about how it's marked, what's expected, providing assessment criteria, providing rubrics, perhaps exemplars or examples, but being really clear about what's expected and making sure that students have the skills to meet those expectations. Providing a supportive environment where people can say, I'm not sure, how do I do this? Feel comfortable asking questions. But also, it's important to normalize the fact that writing can be uncomfortable, particularly if you're really getting to grips with complex ideas. There will come a point sometimes where it feels awful, it feels terrible, it's really uncomfortable. And that can be a really good thing. And that's sometimes what we work with students around in the Student Learning Development Centre. You know, this is actually good, reframing some of these I suppose, confused feelings as a step on the journey to really making sense of the material. Promoting an understanding of academic writing as a journey is really important in the development of self-efficacy and the development of positive beliefs around writing more generally. It's a process for all of us. And sometimes one thing I find quite useful with students is co-writing, where we maybe try and write an abstract or a short summary together. And it's really easy there to see the messiness of the process and how that looks at the beginning is very different to how it looks at the end. And we can all collaborate on that and share strategies. Discussing expectations is key and why they matter. It's also important to make space for reading. Reading can sometimes get pushed out, but to make space for reading, to talk about reading and how we do it. Constructive supportive feedback is really important in developing writing self-efficacy, as too is looking beyond the first year, because sometimes we can forget that. But writing becomes a lot more challenging, and students will often undertake very significant pieces of writing in their final year. So looking at the support. And I suppose in everything that we've been looking at lately, we come back to the importance of taking a programmatic focus, and writing is no exception. So these are just some program focused questions maybe to think about. What are the messages that your students get about reading and writing, intentional and unintentional? Sometimes students can pick up the message that a lot of writing is about avoiding plagiarism rather than engaging in a discipline as a scholar, you know, even from day one. What are they taught, where are they taught, when are they taught it? And that's really important in ensuring that they have the skills and the scaffolding to do what's needed at each stage in each module. Where do they get that chance to discuss the expectations? Like, what do you expect for history writing, for music, for writing about music, for writing in physics and so on? This is one that really struck us. What kind of opportunities do they have to develop the reading and writing across the programme? And that can be difficult to have a good handle on as a lecturer if you're teaching a number of modules. And particularly assessments change. And we often see the number of written assessments in a programme may reduce as other, perhaps more innovative forms of assessment come in. But if students are expected to undertake significant writing assessments in latter stages of the programme, they do need an opportunity to develop those skills. And sometimes they may have fewer opportunities than we realise. So that programme, I view, is really important. And what feedback do they get on their writing across the programme? And can they use it to feed forward to other writing tasks? Even something as simple as reminding them that they can, making that explicit, can really help. And what support is available? A programme-focused approach can really help. Thinking about where academic writing and reading are addressed within a programme can really help to look at opportunities and identify opportunities to support the development of self-efficacy. I just want to finish just by mentioning an initiative we're really excited about at the moment, which is we have a special issue of the All-Ireland Journal of Higher Education in February, which is about student engagement and partnership. And as part of this, we've been able to recruit student reviewers to review the submissions along with staff reviewers. And this is something we've wanted to do for some time. It's conjunction with NSTEP, and ushering from NSTEP is up next. And this is something we really very much hope to continue. So this is something we want to have a look at in terms of the student reviewers' experience and see what lessons we can learn from that. So I would just like to say thank you very much for listening. And I'm just going to stop now. Thank you.
Well, Maura, thanks a million for that. That was very insightful. Thank you for that presentation and your talk through that. And I think just looking at some of the comments in the chat, I could absolutely resonate with what was coming out in the chat and what you were saying, because I think we do focus all of our attention, on the writing part, to say it's the production, and what about the reading part? And I think that's really important. So, the writing, of course, being that formal, tangible output. And then, of course, the reading part is kind of almost invisible or intangible. But yeah, how important is that? That was really important. And I'm really glad you highlighted that, because, again, I can see it coming out here in the chat. And as Laura was talking about earlier, that's kind of metacognition, thinking about what you're reading and reflecting on that as well, I think is really important. So I imagine, Maura, then the lecturers themselves, play a significant part in this in terms of in their modules. So if they're putting up, as we see in the chat here, exemplars that potentially are beyond the capabilities of the students in the class, could that end up being kind of a distraction for the student, or something that maybe would scare them into thinking, oh, I need to be at this particular level? I wonder, is it a range of exemplars that are required or that are level appropriate, just from your experience, Maura?
Yeah, I think a range is really, really, really important. Because as well, sometimes, and I imagine other people have found this as well, sometimes we'd find even without a range, it's almost taken us, this is the way to do it. Whereas the range, I think, really opens opportunities for students. Like, there's lots of ways I could do this. I think I would like to do it like this, or, none of the, that doesn't suit me, I can do it like that. But I do think and I've certainly seen it myself. Sometimes when an example is just, sometimes it's just stunning. It's just incredible. I just think, oh, well, now I'm not going to be able to do that. So that is, the identifiability is really important in saying, yeah, I can do this. I can do this. That's the important. It's going to be hard. It's going to take effort, but I can do it.
Very good. So that you again referring to the scaffolding, and I liked what you talked about, co-writing, and that, I think they're really, really important. So lots of supports in there, and I think I saw in the chat there, Maura, that of course, if we don't cater for this, then you could go down that road of where students believe their only option is to consider breaching